welcome. Before we begin, take a moment and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because stories like this travel across time and borders. And if you believe uncovering real, forgotten history matters, consider subscribing. Each story you hear here is built on deep research, rare records, and long hours spent separating truth from myth. Now let's step back into the year 1855, into a story history itself struggles to explain. In 1855, whispers spread through a small American town about a black girl named Iron Dillard, a name that would soon terrify some and inspire others. She lived in a time when black bodies were treated as expendable, when cruelty often went unpunished, and when silence was enforced through fear. What happened to her was not meant to be remembered. But it was so impossible it refused to disappear. According to surviving accounts, Iron Dillard was accused of something never fully recorded, perhaps defiance, perhaps survival itself. As punishment, she was forced toward open flames. Fire, in that era, was final. Fire erased evidence. Fire ended stories. Witnesses expected screams. They expected ashes. They expected silence. But the fire did not behave as it should have. As the flames rose and wrapped around her body, something unthinkable happened. She did not burn the way fire burns flesh. The crowd watched as moments passed, then longer moments, and still she stood. No collapse, no charred remains, just shock, confusion, and fear spreading faster than the fire itself. Some claimed it was a miracle. Others whispered about curses, protection, or forces they could not name. Those in power quickly tried to control the narrative. Records went missing, details blurred, testimonies contradicted each other. But one fact remained consistent across accounts: the fire failed. Iron Dillard survived that day, but survival came with a cost. After the incident, she vanished from official records. No death certificate, no sale notice, no burial. It was as if history itself tried to erase her, because her existence challenged everything people believed about power, about control, about what could and could not be destroyed. In 1855, the name Iron Dillard was not meant to be remembered. She was a young black girl living in a world where her life held little value in the eyes of those who controlled it. Records describe her as quiet, observant, and unusually resilient, though even those descriptions are rare. What little is known comes from fragmented accounts, whispered testimonies, and documents that survived despite efforts to erase them. Iron Dillard existed in a time when simply being seen as different could become a crime, and her very presence seemed to unsettle those who believed they held absolute power. The incident that sealed her place in mystery began with an accusation that was never clearly defined. Some sources suggest defiance, others hint at refusal to obey an order, while a few imply she knew something she was not supposed to know. No formal charge was written, no trial recorded. Punishment was immediate and brutal, chosen not only to hurt her but to terrify anyone watching. Fire, in that era, was a message, final, irreversible, and public. Witnesses gathered as Iron Dillard was forced toward the flames. They expected fear, screams, and surrender. Fire had always been reliable. It consumed everything equally. But as the flames rose and wrapped around her, the moment stretched into something deeply unsettling. Minutes passed where seconds should have ended it all. People began to murmur as they realized the fire was not taking her the way it was supposed to. Accounts describe confusion turning into panic. Some claimed the flames bent away from her skin. Others said her clothing darkened, but never ignited fully. What remains consistent is that Iron Dillard did not collapse. She remained standing far longer than any human body could endure. The crowd that came to witness destruction instead found themselves staring at something they could not explain. Fear quickly replaced cruelty. Those who had ordered the punishment were suddenly unsure, backing away as if the fire itself had betrayed them. In a society built on control and certainty, Iron Dillard represented chaos. She was proof that not everything obeyed their rules. That terrified them more than defiance ever could. Soon after, the story began to fracture. Some witnesses recanted, others disappeared. Written mentions of Iron Dillard abruptly stopped. No official follow-up, no explanation, no acknowledgement that the event had ever occurred. It was as if history itself was instructed to look away. Silence became the final attempt to regain control. What happened to Iron Dillard afterward remains unknown. She may have been hidden, sold, moved, or deliberately erased from records. But one truth survived the erasure. In 1855, a black girl named Iron Dillard faced fire meant to end her existence, and the fire failed. Whether miracle, mystery, or something lost to time, her story remains one of the most unsettling questions history never answered. In 1855, America was a nation split by fear, power, and contradiction. Slavery was not only legal, but deeply woven into everyday life, especially in the South. Laws existed to protect property, not people, and enslaved black lives were counted, traded, and punished with brutal efficiency. Violence was routine, and public punishment was used as spectacle, a warning meant to crush hope and enforce obedience through terror. This was an era where science, religion, and superstition overlapped in dangerous ways. Many believed suffering was ordained, that pain proved hierarchy, and that those at the bottom were meant to endure whatever was done to them. When something went wrong, when an enslaved person survived what should have killed them, it threatened the fragile logic holding that system together. Order depended on predictability, and predictability depended on fear working every time. Fire, in particular, carried symbolic weight in 1855 America. It was used to destroy evidence, erase rebellion, and deliver final punishment. Burning was not just physical pain, it was public humiliation and spiritual annihilation. Crowds were often encouraged to watch, to learn, to internalize the lesson. The expectation was always the same: fire ends stories. But America in 1855 was also standing on the edge of collapse. Abolitionist movements were growing, slave revolts were whispered about, and the moral foundation of the nation was cracking. Every unexplained survival, every act of resistance, no matter how small, felt like a warning. Stories that challenged the natural order were dangerous because they suggested power was not absolute. When something unexplainable happened, authorities reacted not with curiosity, but with suppression. Records were altered, witnesses silenced, and narratives rewritten. History was shaped by those who controlled the pen, and in 1855 America, the truth was often the first thing sacrificed to maintain control. Mystery was tolerated only when it could be buried. Religion also played a role in shaping reactions. Some saw unexplained survival as divine intervention, others as evil influence. Either interpretation was dangerous. A miracle implied protection beyond human authority. A curse implied power beyond control. Both interpretations weakened the idea that punishment always worked. This was the world Iron Dillard lived in, a world where reality had to behave a certain way, or else everything unraveled. In 1855 America, an event that defied expectation wasn't just strange, it was a threat. And when history feels threatened, it doesn't investigate. It erases. Punishment by fire was one of the most feared methods of control in the 1800s, not because it was common, but because of what it represented. Fire was final. It left nothing behind to question, no body to examine, no story to debate. In a society built on domination, fire was used when someone needed to be erased completely, physically, symbolically, and historically. Unlike beatings or imprisonment, fire was public and deliberate. It was meant to be seen. The act itself served as a warning louder than any spoken threat. Those forced to watch understood the message clearly. Disobedience would not merely hurt, it would annihilate. The pain was expected to be absolute, the outcome unquestioned. There were no rules or protections when fire was chosen as punishment. No trial, no mercy, no record meant to survive. It was often justified as discipline, justice, or necessity, but in truth, it was terror disguised as order. Fire did not need explanation. It answered everything with silence and ash. Those who carried out such punishments trusted fire completely. They believed it never failed. Flesh would burn. Screams would follow. The crowd would look away, shaken back into obedience. Fire was dependable in a world that demanded certainty above all else. Because of this, fire was rarely used unless the intent was permanent removal. Someone punished this way was not expected to survive long enough to tell a story. Memory itself was supposed to die with the flames. That expectation made fire a powerful tool. It ended questions before they could be asked. When punishment by fire did not end as expected, it shattered the logic behind its use. Survival turned a tool of certainty into a source of fear. The crowd no longer felt powerful, they felt exposed. If fire could fail, then control was an illusion. This is why punishment by fire carried such weight in history. It was never just about pain, it was about authority proving itself. And when that authority was challenged by survival, the response was not reflection or justice, but silence, denial, and erasure. When eyewitnesses first gathered, they believed they already knew how the moment would end. They had seen punishment before, had learned to look without intervening, to survive by staying silent. Their faces showed expectation, not curiosity. This was meant to be another routine display of power, something horrible but familiar. As the fire was lit and the flames rose, the crowd leaned in, bracing for the inevitable. Time, however, began to stretch unnaturally. Seconds passed without the screams they anticipated. Then more seconds. Unease rippled through the onlookers as they realized something was wrong, not with the victim, but with the fire itself. Whispers spread quickly. Some claimed the flames were weakening, others insisted they were strong, but strangely unfocused. A few witnesses later described feeling an intense pressure in the air, as if the moment itself was resisting what was supposed to happen. The crowd's confidence began to fracture. Shock replaced certainty. People who had come to witness destruction found themselves frozen, unable to look away. Eyes widened. Backs stiffened. The power dynamic shifted subtly but unmistakably. The watchers were no longer in control of what they were seeing. Fear followed shock. Not the fear of punishment, but the fear of witnessing something forbidden. When reality breaks expectation, the mind searches for explanations, miracles, curses, divine judgment. No explanation felt safe. Each possibility carried consequences no one wanted to face. Those closest to the flames reportedly stepped back first. Authority figures hesitated, suddenly unsure whether to continue or stop. Their hesitation was noticed, and that hesitation mattered. For the first time, control looked uncertain, and uncertainty is contagious. By the time the flames subsided, the crowd was no longer united. Some fled, others stared in silence. What they had witnessed could not be undone, and yet it could not be spoken openly either. The moment lived on only in fragmented memories, distorted by fear, disbelief, and the instinct to survive by forgetting. As the fire took hold, something about it felt wrong to those watching closely. Flames that should have surged violently instead flickered unevenly, as if struggling to maintain their shape. Heat that normally radiated outward seemed contained, localized, almost hesitant. For people who had witnessed fire countless times, this behavior was deeply unsettling. Some accounts describe the flames curling away at strange angles, never fully wrapping around the body as expected. Others said the fire burned brighter in the air than on the ground itself, as though it lacked a target. Even hardened witnesses, people accustomed to cruelty, noticed the difference. Fire was supposed to consume, not hesitate. Time played a role in the fear. The longer the flames failed to do their work, the more impossible the moment became. Human skin was known to blister quickly, yet there was no immediate collapse, no frantic movement that signaled unbearable pain. The fire appeared active, alive, yet ineffective. A few later claimed the sound was wrong. Instead of roaring and cracking, the fire made a dull, uneven noise, as if smothered by something unseen. That detail appears repeatedly in different recollections, separated by time and distance, lending the mystery an eerie consistency. Fire, it seemed, was being resisted. This unnatural behavior forced witnesses to confront a terrifying idea that the laws they trusted might not apply here. In a world that relied on predictable suffering to maintain order, unpredictability was dangerous. If fire could fail once, it could fail again, and that thought spread faster than the flames ever could. Those overseeing the punishment reportedly exchanged glances, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat. Continuing risked exposing their powerlessness. Stopping risked admitting it. The fire, once a symbol of final authority, had become a public embarrassment, an open question burning in front of everyone. When the flames finally died down, they left behind confusion rather than ashes. No clear explanation followed, only hurried silence. The fire's unnatural behavior was never officially acknowledged, but it lingered in memory as the moment certainty cracked. When something humanity depended on refused to obey. When a punishment fails, it doesn't just affect the victim, it shakes the people watching to their core. In the case of Iron Dillard, the fire's refusal to consume her didn't just create confusion, it created panic. The crowd had gathered expecting a straightforward act of cruelty. Instead, they were witnessing something that challenged their most basic assumptions about power and control. For the enslaved and oppressed, witnessing this moment could have been both terrifying and inspiring. Terrifying because it proved that even the most absolute punishments could fail, which suggested that the world was not as predictable as they had been forced to believe. Inspiring because it hinted at a possibility that survival might exist even under the harshest conditions. But hope in such a world was dangerous, dangerous enough that it had to be suppressed. For those in authority, the fear was even more intense. They had built their entire system on the belief that punishment was absolute. When a punishment did not work, it exposed the system as flawed. It suggested that their control was not guaranteed, that their power could be questioned, and that their narrative could be challenged. The fear was not of Iron Dillard herself, but of what her survival represented, a crack in the foundation. The crowd's fear was visible in the way people began to distance themselves from the scene. It wasn't just the heat they moved away from. It was the implication of what they were witnessing. If fire could fail, then the natural order they used to justify cruelty was not natural at all. It was constructed, and constructed things could be dismantled. Witnesses who later recounted the event often sounded shaken, as if they were describing something they still couldn't fully accept. Some said they felt a strange chill despite the flames. Others said they had an overwhelming urge to leave, as if the air itself had turned hostile. Those details suggest that fear wasn't only emotional, it felt physical, like a warning. In a society where fear was used to control, this new fear was dangerous because it was unmanageable. It wasn't fear of a person or a punishment. It was fear of uncertainty. And uncertainty is contagious. Once people realized that even fire could be unpredictable, they began to question everything they had been taught to accept without thinking. That fear is likely one of the reasons the story was suppressed. Not because the event was insignificant, but because it was too significant to allow to spread. The moment the crowd realized that the punishment failed, they understood, whether consciously or not, that the world was not as rigid as those in power claimed. And that realization, once planted, could grow into resistance. After the fire failed to do what it was supposed to do, the first reaction of those in power was not to investigate or understand what happened. Their priority was to control the narrative. The event had already exposed a weakness in the system, and allowing it to be discussed openly would only encourage doubt. So, instead of recording what occurred, they worked to erase it. The process of suppression began immediately. Witnesses were pressured to change their stories, either through intimidation or through bribery. Some were threatened with punishment if they spoke too openly. Others were promised safety or rewards if they kept quiet. The goal was not just to hide the truth, but to reshape it into something harmless, something that could be dismissed as rumor or hysteria. Official records, if they ever existed, were likely altered or destroyed. In many cases, events like this were never written down at all, because those in charge understood that documentation could outlive them. In a society that relied on control, the pen was as powerful as the whip. If the story was recorded accurately, it could spread beyond the town, beyond the state, and become a symbol of defiance. Even when details did survive, they were fragmented and inconsistent. Historians later trying to piece the event together would find gaps where whole pages should have been. They would find testimonies that contradicted each other, not because people lied, but because fear changed how they remembered. When a person is forced into silence, their memory becomes a tool for survival rather than a record of truth. The disappearance of Iron Dillard from official history was part of the suppression. No death record, no sale notice, no mention in census data. It was as if she had never existed. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate act of removing a person from the story because her survival challenged the system's power. Suppression also served as a warning to others. If witnesses could be silenced, then the system could continue operating without scrutiny. The message was clear: if you saw something, you were not allowed to speak. The fear of speaking became part of the punishment itself, extending the control beyond the moment and into the future. In the end, the event became a mystery not because it was impossible to explain, but because the explanation was never allowed to be recorded. The suppression didn't just hide the truth, it turned the truth into a rumor, a legend, a whisper that survived only because it was too powerful to be completely erased. The moment Iron Dillard survived the fire did more than confuse the crowd. It shattered the carefully constructed belief that punishment always worked. In a society built on absolute control, certainty was the foundation. If the system could no longer guarantee outcomes, people began to question the legitimacy of that system. And that was dangerous. For those watching, the event became a kind of forbidden knowledge. It was a truth that couldn't be spoken aloud without consequences. When a person witnesses something that challenges the very structure of their world, the mind tries to rationalize it, to push it away, to make it less threatening. Many witnesses later described the event as a dream or a trick of the eyes, as if denying it could protect them from the fear it created. This was especially true for those who were part of the system. People who benefited from the existing power structure couldn't afford to accept the possibility that it was flawed. To do so would mean accepting that their authority was not as secure as they believed. So, rather than admit uncertainty, they chose denial. They rewrote the story in their own minds, turning it into something that fit their worldview. But denial could not erase the memory completely. The fact that the story persisted at all, in whispered versions, meant that the event had already planted a seed. Even if the crowd didn't speak openly, the knowledge existed in the shared subconscious of those who had seen it. It became a quiet rebellion, a reminder that even the most brutal systems were not unbreakable. The fear of uncertainty also spread to the wider community. If a punishment could fail once, what prevented it from failing again? People began to question whether the system was as reliable as they had been told. That doubt was contagious. Once it began to spread, it could not easily be contained. The survival of Iron Dillard also challenged the concept of human power over life and death. If fire, a symbol of ultimate destruction, could fail, then the idea that some people could be completely controlled was no longer absolute. The event suggested that there were limits to human cruelty, limits that those in power did not want acknowledged. In the end, the fear and uncertainty created by the event were likely more powerful than the fire itself. because it wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story that exposed the fragility of a system built on violence. And when a system's fragility becomes visible, it no longer feels inevitable. It becomes vulnerable. After the fire incident, Iron Dillard seemed to vanish from the world entirely, as if she had been swallowed by the same flames that failed to consume her. There are no reliable records of her afterward. No sale notice, no mention in census records, no trail of documents that might reveal what happened next. It's as though the world deliberately closed its eyes, refusing to acknowledge her continued existence. This disappearance is not surprising, given the context. People in power understood that if Iron Dillard remained visible, her survival would become a symbol. A symbol could inspire others, and inspiration could lead to resistance. In a society where the enslaved were expected to be invisible and powerless, a living contradiction was too dangerous to allow. Some historians suggest she may have been moved far away, hidden or relocated to prevent further attention. Others believe she could have been sold to another region or state, her identity erased and replaced to protect her from retaliation. In a world where names could be changed and records manipulated, it was possible for someone to be made to disappear without a trace. Another theory is that she may have been killed later, quietly and without record. If those who feared her survival believed she posed a threat, they might have chosen a method that left no witnesses, no story, and no evidence. That would have been the easiest way to regain control, not by proving she was dangerous, but by making sure no one could prove she ever existed. But the lack of documentation also raises a more chilling possibility, that the system itself removed her from history. The people who controlled the records could simply decide she did not deserve to be remembered. They could treat her as if she never existed, and the world would accept that because the world was taught to believe what it was told. What remains is a silence that speaks louder than any record. The absence of Iron Dillard's later life is a reminder of how history is shaped by those who survive and those who write. Her disappearance becomes part of the story, not as an afterthought, but as proof that the system was willing to erase anyone who challenged it. In the end, Iron Dillard's vanishing is not just a mystery, it is a statement about power. The fact that she could be erased so completely shows how easily truth can be buried when it threatens the established order, and it also suggests that, even without records, her story survived in the minds of those who witnessed it, because some truths refuse to be forgotten. The moment Iron Dillard survived the flames, people were forced to choose how they would interpret it. Some immediately framed it as a miracle, a sign of divine protection. In a time when religion shaped nearly every aspect of life, the idea that God had intervened was powerful and terrifying. If a higher power was protecting someone the system considered worthless, then the system itself was being judged. That interpretation threatened the very foundation of authority, because it suggested that human power was not supreme. Others, however, saw the event as something darker. They whispered about curses, witchcraft, or supernatural forces. In a society that feared the unknown, it was easier to explain the impossible as something evil rather than something miraculous. Calling it a curse allowed people to maintain their sense of control. They could pretend it was not a challenge to the system, but a threat that needed to be eliminated. The debate between miracle and myth also served as a way for people to distance themselves from the truth. If it was a miracle, then it was beyond human understanding, something they could accept without changing anything. If it was a curse, it was dangerous and needed to be feared, which again allowed people to avoid acknowledging the real issue, that the punishment had failed. Either way, the interpretations helped the community cope without confronting the deeper implications. The uncertainty about what happened made the story even more powerful. When people cannot explain something, they fill the gap with meaning, and the meaning they chose reflected their fears and hopes. For some, Iron Dillard became a symbol of hope, a sign that survival was possible. For others, she became a symbol of danger, a reminder that the world could not be controlled as they believed. This is why the story spread in fragmented ways. Different versions emerged based on who was telling it and what they needed it to mean. Some accounts emphasized divine protection, painting Iron Dillard as a chosen figure. Others emphasized darkness and fear, turning her into a warning. The truth became less important than the meaning people derived from it. Over time, the miracle vs. curse debate blurred the lines between history and legend. Without solid records, the story was shaped by imagination and fear, and each retelling altered the details. But even as the details changed, the core mystery remained. How could a fire fail to burn? Ultimately, the interpretations themselves reveal something about the society that witnessed the event. The fact that people immediately turned to supernatural explanations shows how deeply they relied on belief systems to make sense of the world. It also shows how unwilling they were to accept a more unsettling truth, that the system they depended on could fail, and that fear of failure may have been the most powerful force behind the suppression of the story. The story of Iron Dillard is not only about a fire that failed, it's about how power works when it fears being questioned. In a society built on slavery, control was maintained through constant intimidation, violence, and the belief that those in power could do anything without consequence. Iron Dillard's survival shattered that belief, revealing a gap between what the powerful claimed and what reality allowed. For those who enforced the system, the incident was an embarrassment. Their authority depended on the idea that punishment was absolute and inevitable. When that idea was proven false, even briefly, it revealed a vulnerability. It suggested that power was not divine or natural, but constructed, and therefore possibly removable. That realization was dangerous because it planted doubt. Power also depends on fear. The more people fear the consequences of disobedience, the more control the system holds. Iron Dillard's survival threatened to weaken that fear. If punishment could fail, then the threat of punishment lost some of its power. Even if only a few people believed it, that belief was enough to spark resistance in a world where resistance was rare and costly. The authorities likely understood this instinctively. They knew that the event could inspire others to question or resist, so they moved quickly to erase it. The suppression was not just about hiding what happened, it was about maintaining the illusion that power was total. The system needed people to believe that cruelty was inevitable and that survival was impossible. The story also challenges the idea that power is always visible. In Iron Dillard's case, the most powerful force was not the fire, but the fear it created when it failed. That fear spread quietly, reshaping the minds of those who witnessed it. Even if they never spoke openly, they carried the knowledge that the system could be challenged. That knowledge is a form of power in itself. In this way, Iron Dillard's story becomes a warning to those who rely on control. Power that cannot withstand uncertainty is fragile. When the tools of control fail, the system must either adapt or collapse. In the 1850s, the system chose suppression, attempting to rebuild certainty through silence. But suppression cannot erase what people have seen. The event lived on in the memories of witnesses and in the fragments of records that survived. Even if the story was buried, it did not disappear completely. It became a quiet reminder that power is not absolute, and that even the most brutal systems are vulnerable to the unexpected. And perhaps that is why the story endures, because it reveals a truth that those in power tried to hide, that control is never guaranteed, and that the human spirit, no matter how oppressed, can still find ways to survive even when the world is set on fire. The mystery of Iron Dillard is not only that she survived the fire, but that the truth of what happened was never allowed to fully exist. Even today, historians struggle to find concrete evidence. The surviving details are scattered, inconsistent, and often contradicted by one another. This is not unusual for events involving enslaved people, whose lives were often undocumented and whose suffering was considered unworthy of record. But in Iron Dillard's case, the absence feels intentional, like a story was deliberately removed from the archive of history. The lack of reliable records forces us to confront a difficult question: what is history, if not what is written down? When the powerful control what gets recorded, they also control what is remembered. Iron Dillard's story highlights how history can be shaped not just by what happened, but by who gets to tell it. If the record is incomplete, then the truth becomes a matter of interpretation, rumor, and legend. Even the name, Iron Dillard, may be symbolic rather than factual. It could be a nickname given by witnesses who saw her survive and could not explain it. Names like that can become a way for communities to hold onto a story when they have no official record. It becomes a label for a miracle, a mystery, or a warning. The name itself becomes part of the legend, a way to keep the memory alive without exposing the person behind it. The mystery also raises the possibility that the story was altered on purpose to prevent it from inspiring others. If the truth was too dangerous, it would be safer for those in power to allow only a distorted version to survive. A distorted story can be dismissed as myth, while the real truth would be too powerful to risk. This could explain why the details are so inconsistent and why the story never appears clearly in official archives. But even with these gaps, the story has persisted. It has survived in oral histories, in fragmented documents, and in the imagination of those who believe that some truths are too important to be buried. That persistence is itself remarkable. It shows how, even when history tries to erase a person, memory can continue to resist. In the end, the mystery is not only about what happened to Iron Dillard, it's about why her story still matters. Because it challenges the idea that history is fixed. It reminds us that history is a collection of choices about what to remember and what to forget. And it asks us to consider what other stories were erased and what those stories would reveal if they were allowed to be told. The mystery remains because the truth is uncomfortable. It forces us to confront the reality that the world was, and still is, built on systems of power that prefer silence over truth. Iron Dillard's story survives as a warning that even the most brutal histories can't fully erase the human spirit. And perhaps that is why, after all these years, the flames still refuse to burn her from memory.